My son-in-law grabbed my wrist at dinner and said, "Stay out of our business." I looked at his hand, then at him. "Let go, and then Google who owns the company you work for." He Googled it under the table. He let go. That was 7 months ago. What happened in the hours and weeks that followed is the story I've been deciding whether to tell. I've decided to tell it now, not because I want to embarrass anyone, but because I think there are people sitting in similar dining rooms with similar hands wrapped around their wrists who need to understand that the moment you go silent is the moment you lose. My name is Eleanor. I'm 69 years old. I have one daughter, Vivian, who I raised alone after her father left when she was 4, which tells you something important about how carefully I built the world she grew up in and how seriously I took the responsibility of being the only architecture of her childhood. I worked as a hospital administrator for 34 years. I understand organizational structure the way some people understand music, intuitively, immediately, able to hear when something is off before I can identify exactly which note is wrong. I retired at 63 with a pension, a paid-off house, and a portfolio my financial advisor described as the result of 3 decades of disciplined decisions. I had built something, not because I was lucky, because I was deliberate. Vivian is 38 now. She's a landscape architect with her own small firm and a talent for seeing potential in spaces that other people have given up on. She has Carol's. She has my mother's patience and my stubbornness, which is a combination that tends to produce either very successful people or very frustrated ones. In Vivian's case, it produced both. She met Daniel at a professional conference 4 years ago. He was 41, divorced once, no children from the first marriage, which he mentioned on the 3rd dinner I had with him in a way that felt like a resume item rather than a piece of personal history. He was good-looking in the way that people sometimes use as a substitute for depth, well-dressed, easy with compliments, the kind of man who makes waitstaff feel seen when other people are watching and impatient when they aren't. I noticed that the first night. Vivian hadn't brought him to the house yet. We met at a restaurant she'd chosen, a nicer place than she usually picked, which told me she wanted him to be comfortable more than she wanted me to be familiar. He stood when I arrived at the table. He pulled out my chair. He said he'd heard so much about me, all of it good. His smile was wide and practiced in the particular way of a man who has used it many times before and knows exactly which version of it works for which audience. Over dinner, he asked me about the hospital, about administration, about the challenges of managing large institutions, about whether I missed the authority of the role. The questions were well formed. He had clearly done some preparation. But mixed into those questions were others that landed differently. Did the house feel too big now that Vivian had moved out? Had I thought about downsizing? Were the upkeep costs significant on a property that size? Was it difficult managing an investment portfolio alone without a partner to share the decision-making? Each question was delivered warmly, wrapped in apparent concern, the tone of a man who was simply getting to know the important people in his partner's life. Vivian didn't notice. She was watching him the way she had watched things she couldn't believe she'd been lucky enough to find. I knew that expression. I had worn it once myself, before her father had taught me what it cost to mistake performance for character. On the drive home, I called my attorney, a woman named Margaret, who had been handling my affairs for 16 years and who had long since learned to read my calls by their hour. She picked up on the second ring. "I need you to run through everything with me," I said. "The trust structure, the property deed, the beneficiary designations, all of it." "Eleanor," she said with the patience of a person who has heard this tone before, "did something happen?" "Not yet," I said, "but I want to make sure that when it does, we're already prepared." She was quiet for a moment. "Come in Thursday," she said. "We'll go through all of it." That was 3 years ago. Vivian and Daniel got engaged 18 months after that dinner. She called me on a Tuesday evening, her voice at a pitch I recognized from when she was 9, and had found a stray cat she was certain we should keep. That particular combination of excitement and preemptive defensiveness. She knew there was a version of my response that would disappoint her, and she was bracing for it while hoping for the other one. I told her I was happy for her. I told her I looked forward to getting to know Daniel better. I told her the ring sounded beautiful and that I hoped she'd brought it over so I could see it. Then I called Margaret the next morning and asked her to accelerate the review we'd been slowly working through. There was one conversation I had with Daniel before the wedding that I want to describe carefully, because it tells you something important about the kind of man he was. Vivian had asked me to join them for dinner at her apartment 3 months before the wedding. She was cooking. He arrived 20 minutes before I did, which meant we had several minutes alone together while she finished in the kitchen. He sat across from me at her small dining table with a glass of wine and an expression that suggested he'd been waiting for exactly this opportunity. He said, "Eleanor, I want you to know that I'm aware you have concerns about me." I said, "What gives you that impression?" He said, "I pay attention to people. It's something I'm good at. And I've noticed that you ask Vivian certain questions when you two speak. Questions about our plans, about how I'm thinking about our future financially. She tells me things. She trusts me completely." I kept my expression neutral. He continued, "I think we got off on the wrong foot. I think you saw a divorced man in his 40s, and you made certain assumptions, which I understand. You're protective of your daughter. That's admirable. But I want you to know that I'm not interested in your assets. I have my own career. I make a good living. Everything I have, I've built myself." He paused, letting that sit. Then he said, "I just want you to give us a fair chance." It was a very good speech. It was the speech of a man who had identified the concern and addressed it directly, which made it feel like honesty when it was actually the most sophisticated form of deflection. Because a man who truly wasn't interested in my assets wouldn't have inventoried them so precisely in every conversation we'd had, wouldn't have known as he demonstrated in that speech by referencing them obliquely, exactly what they consisted of. Wouldn't have used the phrase, "I have my own career," as though that were a rebuttal to a question I hadn't asked. I said, "Daniel, I appreciate you saying that. I want very much to be wrong about any concerns I have." He smiled. "I think you will be." I went home that night and called Margaret again. "The prenuptial agreement," I said. "I want it in place before the wedding. How do we make that happen?" We made it happen. It wasn't easy. Daniel's attorney pushed back on several provisions. Daniel himself told Vivian it felt insulting, that it implied the family didn't trust him, that it set a tone for the marriage that he worried they'd never fully recover from. Vivian called me in tears one evening, 3 weeks before the wedding. She said, "Mom, why is this necessary? Why can't you just accept that he's a good person? Why do you always have to protect against everything instead of just trusting sometimes?" I said, "I trust you completely. I trust your judgment, your instincts, your heart. A prenuptial agreement isn't about distrust. It's about making sure that if anything ever went wrong, both of you walk away with exactly what you came in with. It protects him as much as it protects you." That wasn't entirely true, but it was true enough, and it got us to the wedding with a signed document. Daniel signed it 4 days before the ceremony, with an expression that suggested he had decided the cost of losing the wedding was higher than the cost of signing something he believed he could eventually work around. I had seen that calculation before. I had been watching for exactly that calculation. The wedding was in May, at a venue outside the city, the kind of place that photographs beautifully and costs accordingly. The flowers were elaborate. The menu was the most expensive option available. I paid for a significant portion of it because Vivian was my daughter and because some things matter more than the money they cost. Daniel kissed my cheek at the reception and said I looked beautiful and that he'd never seen Vivian happier. Her eyes were shining, and he was right about that part. She was happy. I looked at my daughter's face and thought, I hope I am wrong about everything. I was not wrong about anything. They moved into his condo after the honeymoon. He'd bought it 6 years earlier, a 2-bedroom in a building with a gym and a doorman, the kind of place that signals a certain level of income without necessarily confirming it. Within 2 months, Vivian was mentioning that the condo felt small for what they were imagining their life to be. She mentioned it to me the way she mentioned it to herself, not as a complaint exactly, more as a thought she was working through. She wondered if they shouldn't look for a house, something with a yard, a real neighborhood. She said Daniel thought it made sense to look in the area near my house, since the schools were good and the neighborhood was established and the property values were stable. The houses near me were larger, she said, more in line with what they were picturing. I told her I thought it was a fine idea and that I'd be happy to help them think through what they could realistically afford. 2 weeks later, she mentioned that Daniel had suggested it might actually make more financial sense to move into my house with me. Save costs. The house was large. I was alone. I had 3 bedrooms and a yard that was more than one person needed, and it would give them time to save for a down payment on something of their own. I told Vivian I valued my privacy and wasn't ready for that kind of arrangement. I also told her, as gently as I was able to, that I had noticed a pattern in the conversation she'd been bringing to me, and that I was concerned about where those conversations were originating. She got quiet the way she got quiet when she felt I was criticizing something she wanted me to accept. She said I was being unfair. She said Daniel was just trying to think practically. She said I had never really given him a fair chance, and that my protectiveness had become a kind of control that she found difficult to be around sometimes. That last part stayed with me for a long time, not because it was wrong exactly, because I wasn't sure it was entirely wrong. I held on to that uncertainty like something important, the possibility that I was the problem, that my caution had become something more defensive than the situation required. I held on to it for almost 8 months, during which time the pattern continued. The house came up 4 more times through different framings. Daniel mentioned to Vivian that my property taxes must be significant and that it might be worth reviewing whether I needed help managing things. He told her that single women my age living alone in large properties sometimes struggled with the practical realities of upkeep. He said he'd spoken to a contractor friend of his who could come assess the property and help identify any issues before they became expensive. That last one ended the 8 months of uncertainty. I called Margaret. I told her everything. She was quiet for a long time, in the way that people who have heard many such stories go quiet when they recognize the shape of another one. "Eleanor," she said finally, "everything is as protected as it can be, but you need to have a direct conversation with your daughter." "I know," I said, "and you need to have it before something happens that makes it impossible to have." "I know," I said again. I was still working out how to have it when the dinner happened. It was a Saturday in October. Vivian had invited me for dinner at Daniel's condo, which had become their condo over the past 2 years in the way that spaces become shared through the accumulation of small rearrangements. There were 4 of us at the table: Vivian and Daniel, a couple they'd invited from their building, Marcus and Janet, a pleasant pair who worked in finance and talked comfortably about things I didn't find particularly interesting. Dinner was fine until it wasn't. We were on the main course when Daniel said something about real estate in my neighborhood, about a property 2 streets from my house that had just sold for considerably more than expected. He said, "It just shows you, Mom, that the equity position in that house is extraordinary right now. You're sitting on something really significant. It would be a shame not to think strategically about it." I said, "I think about it." He said, "I'm sure you do, but it might be worth having a professional review just to make sure you're maximizing the opportunity. We've actually been speaking with someone." I said, "Daniel?" He continued, "who specializes in estate planning for people in your situation, widows and retirees with significant assets and no clear succession plan." I said, "Daniel." He looked up. "I have a succession plan. I have an attorney a financial advisor, a trust established 17 years ago, and a very clear picture of exactly what I want to happen with everything I've built. What I don't have is a need for additional input from someone I didn't ask. The table went quiet. Vivian was looking at her plate. Marcus and Janet had developed a sudden interest in their wine glasses. Daniel set down his fork. He looked at me for a moment with an expression that made a brief, failed attempt at warmth before settling into something flatter. He said, "I'm just trying to help. We're family. I think we can talk about these things." I said, "We can talk about many things. The structure of my estate is not one of them." He said, "Eleanor." His voice had taken on a different quality, something that wanted to sound patient but was working around an edge underneath. "You've made it very clear over the past 2 years that you don't trust me. You've made it very clear that you have concerns that you've never directly expressed but that Vivian feels constantly. She carries the weight of your disapproval every time she comes home from seeing you. Do you know what that does to a person? Do you know what it does to a marriage?" I looked at my daughter. She was still looking at her plate, but I saw her jaw tighten in the way it had tightened since she was a teenager when something was being said that she didn't want to be happening. I said, "Vivian, look at me." She looked up. I said, "Has there been a single conversation between you and me in the past 2 years that you haven't repeated to Daniel?" She hesitated. That hesitation told me something I had not quite allowed myself to know. Daniel reached across the table and wrapped his hand around my wrist. Not hard, not violently, but with a deliberateness that was unmistakably intentional. "The way you grip something to stop it from moving," he said. "Stay out of our business." I looked at his hand. I looked at it for long enough that the table understood I was looking at it deliberately. Then I looked at him. I said, "Let go. And then Google who owns the company you work for." He smiled. The practiced smile. "What does that have to do with anything?" I said, "Let go first, then you'll understand." He let go. He picked up his phone. He looked like a man who was about to demonstrate that I had said something meaningless. I watched his face while he read. I watched the exact moment he found it. His eyes went very still. The practiced smile didn't disappear so much as pause, like a program encountering a file it hadn't expected. He set the phone down. I said, "The commercial property management company you've worked for since before you and Vivian met was acquired 4 years ago by a holding group. That holding group has 3 primary investors. I am one of them. I have been one of them for 11 years. I own a 17% stake. Your salary, your benefits, your position, your office, the parking space you use every morning, they run through an organizational structure that includes me. I have never intervened in your employment. I have never mentioned it to your supervisors. I have not used it, and I have no intention of using it. But I want you to understand something clearly. I am not the vulnerable elderly woman sitting on an asset you haven't figured out how to access yet. I am the person who built the architecture that you've been working inside of without knowing it. And I am telling you, with considerable patience, to let go of my wrist and reconsider the posture you've decided to take at my daughter's dinner table." Marcus cleared his throat quietly. Janet had set down her fork. Vivian was looking at me. I turned to her. I said, "I owe you a conversation, a real one. Not the one I've been trying to find the right moment for 2 years. The actual one, with everything in it. Can you come to the house tomorrow morning?" She looked at Daniel. He was looking at the table, a man recalibrating in real time, working through what had just changed and what it meant. She looked back at me. She said, "Yes." I drove home that night with the kind of clarity that comes after you've stopped waiting for a better moment to do a difficult thing. The following morning, she arrived at 9. I made coffee. We sat at the kitchen table, the same table I had sat at through 38 years of decisions, and I told her everything, not as an accusation, not as a prosecution of the man she'd married, but as a record laid out plainly and in order of what I had seen, what I had done about it, what I had protected, and where I had made mistakes. I told her about the trust, established the year her father left, when she was 4 years old, and I had understood for the first time what it meant to be someone else's only safety net. I had set it up not out of fear exactly, but out of a very clear-eyed understanding that love without structure was just intention, waiting to be disappointed by circumstances. I told her the house was held in trust. I told her the investment accounts were held in trust. I told her she was the sole beneficiary, had been for 34 years, and that the prenuptial agreement she'd signed 4 days before her wedding was the single most important document I had quietly ensured existed. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "You had all of this in place before you met him." "Before I met him," I confirmed. "And the company," she said, "the investment in his company. Did you know when I introduced you?" I said, "I didn't know he worked there until you told me his employer on the second dinner. I recognized the name. I looked into it. I didn't say anything because it wasn't relevant until last night." She held her coffee mug with both hands. She said, "Why didn't you tell me you were worried about him? Not the trust, not the investments. Why didn't you just say, 'Vivian, I'm worried about this man,' in a way I'm asking you to hear?" I said, "I tried twice. The first time was about 8 months after you met him, and you told me I was protective in the way that single mothers sometimes become when their daughters find partners who don't need anything from them. You said it kindly, but you closed the door. And the second time? 6 months before the wedding. I said I thought we should talk before things got further along. You said you knew I had concerns, but that you were asking me to trust you. And I made the mistake of choosing your comfort over your information. That was wrong. I should have said it plainly regardless of how you received it. That's mine to own." She looked out the window. The yard was still, the light early and thin the way October light is thin in the morning. She said, "He's been asking me things for 2 years, about the house, about your accounts, about what would happen to everything when you were gone. He framed it as being practical, planning ahead. I told myself That was just how he thought about things, that he was careful and organized, that it was a good quality in a partner. I said, "When did you start wondering if that was true?" She was quiet for a moment. "About 4 months ago," she said. "We had an argument about money. He was upset that I'd turned down a project because the timeline conflicted with something personal. He said I didn't take our financial picture seriously enough. I said we were fine. He said we weren't as fine as I thought, and that we needed to think more aggressively about the future. I asked him what he meant. He said—" She stopped. She set down her mug. She said, "He said that we couldn't count on your situation remaining as stable as it currently appeared, that health can change quickly at your age, that there were decisions that should be made now rather than later." He made it sound like concern. But the way he said your age, the way he said currently stable, something about it stayed with me. I didn't want to look at it directly. I said, "I know. Sometimes we don't look directly at things because the view from looking directly is too frightening to manage." She nodded. She said, "He's been pushing for us to have joint accounts. Just one, just for convenience. He said it was strange that we kept things so separate. He said it was a trust issue." I said, "Did you open one?" "No," she said. "I told him I wasn't ready. He brought it up 4 more times." I said, "I'm going to tell you something, Vivian, that I want you to hear as your mother and not as a person who told you so." She looked at me. "The man you married has been methodical. He has been patient. He has said the right things at almost exactly the right moments. He managed your confidence in me by framing my protectiveness as something that diminished you. He managed my access to you by making himself the interpreter of every difficult conversation. That is not the behavior of a man who loves someone carelessly. It is the behavior of someone who has thought carefully about how to be in a position that he intends to eventually use." She said, "What do I do?" And I heard in her voice, at 38 years old, the same thing I had heard when she was 4 and her father had left, and she had stood in the kitchen with the particular confusion of a child who understands something terrible has happened, but cannot yet organize the feeling into language. I crossed the room and put my hand over hers. I said, "You don't have to decide anything today. You have time. Everything that matters is protected. The only thing that needs to happen right now is that you know the full truth and that you stop carrying the weight of my silence on top of it." She cried then, not dramatically, the quiet kind of crying that happens when relief and grief arrive at the same moment. I let her. I did not try to manage it toward resolution. Some things need to finish in their own time, and the role of the person sitting next to them is simply to stay. The weeks that followed were complicated in the way that all necessary things are complicated. Vivian had 3 more conversations with Daniel before she told him she wanted a separation. I know what happened in those conversations only from what she told me afterward, and I'll tell you what she told me, because she said she wanted it said. In the first conversation, he apologized. He said the dinner had gotten out of hand, that he'd been stressed at work, that his behavior was inexcusable, and he was genuinely ashamed. He said he loved her. He said he was afraid of losing her. He cried, which he had apparently never done before in their entire relationship, which told Vivian something important about the specific occasion he'd chosen to do it. In the second conversation, he shifted. He said that her mother had been interfering in their marriage from the beginning, that she'd poisoned Vivian against him systematically, that the prenuptial agreement was proof of premeditated distrust, that any man would have snapped eventually under the sustained pressure of a mother-in-law who had decided before he walked in the door that he wasn't good enough. He said Vivian had to choose between a relationship with her mother and a real marriage. Vivian said, "My mother told me everything she'd kept from me. She sat at her kitchen table and admitted every mistake she'd made and answered every question I had without making excuses. Then she told me what she'd seen and laid it out so clearly that I understood exactly why she'd been afraid." Daniel said, "She manipulated you?" Vivian said, "She protected me, and she's been doing it since I was 4 years old with no one to protect her. You're asking me to choose. I've chosen." In the third conversation, he told her the apartment was in his name, that she'd have to find somewhere else to go, that he had rights she was underestimating, that the prenuptial agreement was something his attorney would challenge. Vivian called Margaret from her car. Margaret told her, in the calm voice of a woman who had heard this exact call before, that the apartment was indeed his separate property, that her personal belongings and her half of the joint account were hers without question, that the prenuptial agreement had been reviewed and was as airtight as anything Margaret had ever drafted, and that Vivian was welcome to come stay in the house that was held in a trust that no one had ever found a way around. She moved into my guest room that weekend with 2 suitcases and her drafting table and a photograph she'd had in the apartment of the 2 of us from her college graduation. She set it on the dresser without saying anything about it. I noticed. The first week was quiet, in the way that weeks are quiet after loud things have happened. We moved around each other carefully, the way people do when they're figuring out the new dimensions of a shared space. She worked at the dining room table. I gave her the Wi-Fi password and cleared her a drawer in the bathroom and left her alone in the way she'd always needed to be left alone when she was working through something difficult. On the 4th evening, she came into the kitchen while I was making dinner and sat at the table and said, "Tell me about the investment group. How did that happen?" I told her. I had been looking for ways to diversify about 11 years earlier, a year after her father had resurfaced briefly, and I had watched how easily people assumed that a woman managing her own finances alone must need help managing them. My financial advisor had mentioned the holding group. The commercial real estate sector had been something I'd followed since my years in hospital administration, where property and space were constant institutional concerns. I'd done my research, I'd asked the right questions, I'd invested. "You never told me," she said. "No." "Why?" I said. "Because I didn't want you growing up with a clear picture of what I had instead of a clear picture of what you could build. Your confidence in yourself matters more to me than your comfort about my assets. I wanted you to know you could do it on your own before you knew. It didn't entirely matter whether you could or couldn't. She was quiet. Then she said, "That's the same reason you didn't tell me about the trust." "Yes, and it was wrong, wasn't it? For the same reason." I said, "Yes, information protects people. Keeping it from them, even with good intentions, takes something from them that belongs to them. I protected you from the wrong things for the right reasons. And somewhere in the middle of that, I forgot that you were capable of handling the truth and making your own decisions with it." She nodded. She got up and stood at the counter and looked out the window at the yard where the garden beds needed work, and neither of us had gotten to them. She said, "I think I knew. Not everything, but something. I think somewhere in the past 2 years there was a part of me that understood what he was actually thinking about when he asked about your house or your health or your plans." I said, "And?" She said, "And I loved him, or I thought I did. Or I loved the version of him that showed up in the first year before the patience ran thin and the calculations started showing through. That version was worth loving. I'm not sure now if it was ever real." I said, "I think the early version of people is almost always real. It's what they do with you after that tells you what the feelings were built on." She looked at me. "That's actually useful," she said. "You should have said things like that more often, instead of quietly calling your attorney every 6 months." I laughed. She laughed. It was the first time in a very long time that I had laughed with my daughter about something real. The divorce took 5 months. The prenuptial agreement held in exactly the way Margaret had said it would. Daniel's attorney reviewed the terms and advised him to accept them. He did, but not without a final attempt to negotiate one provision that would have given him a small percentage of the increased property value of my house during the period of the marriage, on the theory that his conversations about real estate strategy constituted a form of contribution. Margaret dismissed that in 2 paragraphs. She sent me the letter. I read it at the kitchen table and felt the specific satisfaction of watching preparation meet its moment. He made one more call to Vivian after the papers were signed. She told me about it at Sunday dinner, matter-of-factly, the way she had begun to tell me things since the kitchen table conversation that had changed something between us. He'd called to say that she would always be limited by choosing her mother over her marriage, that she had allowed herself to be controlled by a woman who built walls around things and called it love. She told me what she'd said in response. She said, "I told him that my mother built walls around things because she was the only person standing between me and everything that could hurt me for the first decade of my life. And that when someone does that for you for long enough, you learn the difference between walls that trap you and walls that keep the right things safe. And that I was grateful I'd learned the difference in time." She paused. She was cutting into the chicken I'd made with the recipe that had survived 30 years of Sunday dinners. She said, and then I hung up. I had to look away. The window above the sink, the yard beyond it, the garden beds still needing work, the light going long and late the way it does in spring. I thought about the 4-year-old in the kitchen who had stood still and confused while everything reorganized itself around her. About the woman she had become in spite of everything and because of everything, and with a clarity about what mattered that I recognized as something she had arrived at herself, not something I had given her. I said, "Your grandmother would have liked who you are." She looked up. "Tell me something about her," she said, "something I don't already know." I told her. We stayed at the table until the food was cold, and then I heated it up again, and we stayed some more. A month later, she started mentioning someone named Patrick. She mentioned him the way people mention things they are deliberately not making a big deal of, because they very much want to. He was a landscape architect she'd worked alongside on a municipal project 3 years ago, recently moved back to the city from Portland. They'd run into each other at a professional event and had dinner afterward. Just dinner, she said, nothing formal. She mentioned that he'd insisted they split the check. She mentioned that he'd texted the next day to ask about a plant species she'd referenced in passing because he'd looked it up and found it interesting. She mentioned that he'd grown up with a single mother. "Ah," I said. She smiled. "I knew you'd do that." "I didn't do anything." "You said 'ah' in that particular way. I found it relevant." She shook her head, but she was still smiling. "I'd like you to meet him," she said, "when the time is right. No pressure. Whatever makes sense." I said, "A Sunday dinner. Nothing formal. Whatever makes sense." That Sunday dinner is 3 weeks away. I have made no advanced judgments. I have opened no files. I have not called Margaret. I have simply kept the house ready the way I have kept it ready for 34 years, a place where the people who deserve to be here will always be able to come, and where everything that matters is protected in ways that mean the table is always safe enough for the honest things to be said at it. Last week, I changed something I had been meaning to change for a long time. The trust document has a provision that had always bothered me slightly, a clause that made the transfer of control contingent on Vivian reaching a specific age or on my death. I had Margaret amend it. The new language allows Vivian to assume co-trustee status immediately with full visibility into every account, every property, every investment. She came over the day Margaret sent the paperwork, and we signed it at the kitchen table. She looked at the documents for a long time before signing. She said, "You're trusting me with all of it." I said, "I was always trusting you with all of it. I was just slow about letting you know." She signed. She handed the pen back. She sat for a moment, looking at her signature on the document that outlined everything I had built over the years since the day her father left, and I had understood what it meant to be someone else's only foundation. Then she said, "I'm going to earn this." I said, "You already have, multiple times over, in ways that had nothing to do with money." She nodded. She stood up. She said she had a project deadline and needed to get back to her drafting table, which had moved from the guest room to the corner of the study where the light was better. I watched her walk down the hall. I thought about the wrist, about the hand that had gripped it with such specific confidence. about the expression on his face when he'd looked down at his phone and found what he'd found. I don't think about it with satisfaction. I think about it the way I think about any moment when preparation and timing arrived at exactly the right intersection, with a quiet and practical gratitude. Because the point was never the confrontation. The point was what the confrontation made possible. The conversation at the kitchen table, the documents signed in the morning light. A daughter who knows everything now and is better equipped because of it. A guest room that held her when she needed holding and is now empty again for the right reasons. A Sunday dinner in 3 weeks at a table that is finally free of everything that was built on falsehood. And a house that has always been, more than anything else, the physical record of a deliberate life. The combination to the study is not a birthday anymore. I changed it last month. It's the date of the morning Vivian sat across from me with her coffee and heard everything. I punch it in every day, and I'm reminded of what honesty costs and what it's worth. Both are significant. The second one is higher. There is one more thing I want to say before I close this out, because I've been thinking about it since the dinner, since the moment he put his hand on my wrist and looked at me with the particular confidence of a man who has decided he is speaking to someone who has no leverage. I want to say it for the people who are watching this from a position I recognize. The person at the table who sees something and doesn't say it. The parent who waits for the right moment until the right moment has cost them something. The woman sitting across from a man who is explaining her own finances to her as though she stumbled into them accidentally rather than building them with 40 years of decisions. The moment he grabbed my wrist was not the first moment I could have acted. It was simply the moment I chose to stop waiting for a better one. The information I had that night I had possessed for 3 years. The preparation was already in place. The documents were signed. The structure was built. The only thing missing was the willingness to use what I had built out loud in front of other people without apology. I spent 2 years managing the temperature of that table, trying to be warm enough for Vivian without being distant enough from Daniel to confirm the story he was telling her about me, trying to protect without being seen as controlling, trying to prepare without being accused of prejudging. It is exhausting, that work, and I want to be honest about that because I think the exhaustion is part of the reason people stay quiet longer than they should. Not because they don't know. They know. Not because they haven't prepared. Some of them have prepared more carefully than I had. But because the act of speaking plainly in a room where speaking plainly will change the shape of everything requires a particular kind of will that can be very difficult to locate when you love someone who is sitting across from you and doesn't yet understand what you're trying to tell them. Vivian understood eventually, not all at once, not the night of the dinner, but in layers, the way people understand things that require them to look directly at something they've been turning slightly away from. I was patient with those layers. I answered every question. I said, I'm sorry for the things I owed an apology for without adding qualifications or routing the apology back toward the other party. That part was important. If you want someone to hear a difficult truth about a person they've chosen, You cannot spend the same breath defending yourself against the accusation of having seen it too soon. Acknowledge what you withheld. Acknowledge what you should have said earlier. Say it is on you. Mean it. And then say the thing you have to say. Vivian heard me because I gave her something real before I asked her to look at something real. That's the only reason it worked. Not the legal preparation, not the investment stake, not the hand on the table. Those things were useful. They solved the specific practical problem, but the thing that actually mattered was the kitchen table the next morning. Two women with 38 years of complicated love between them, deciding finally to stop managing each other's comfort and just tell the truth. I have thought about that morning every day since. Not the dinner with its drama, not the moment with the phone and the table going quiet. The morning after, the coffee, the light coming in low through the window, my daughter's hands around her mug, and her face open for the first time in years in a way that reminded me of who she'd been before she got careful. That morning cost more than any dinner. It cost the thing I'd been protecting most carefully, which wasn't the house or the trust or the investment accounts. It was the version of myself that had everything handled and didn't need to admit to the person who trusted me most that I had been afraid, too. Afraid of losing her to a wrong choice, afraid that saying it plainly would push her toward it rather than away, afraid that I would be alone in the way I had been alone before, and that this time there would be no 4-year-old to make the shape of the rooms make sense. I told her that part too, at the end, after the documents, after the coffee had gone cold. I said, I want you to know that part of what kept me quiet for so long was that I was afraid, not just for you, for myself. And that's something I should have figured out earlier, rather than letting it become part of the wall between us. She said, I know, Mom. I've known for a while. And that was the most important thing anyone said to me in any of those conversations, not because it absolved me, because it meant she had been seeing me more clearly than I had realized, which meant I hadn't needed to manage her half as carefully as I'd been managing her, which meant I could stop. I have stopped. I leave the study unlocked most days now, not the whole house. The study, the room where the fireproof cabinet is, where the documents live, where the photograph of my mother sits on the corner of the desk with her expression that always looks to me like it knows something I'm about to figure out. Vivian comes in sometimes when she's at the house working on a project. She makes coffee. She brings me a cup. She sits across the desk and reads or works on her drawings or asks me questions about the investment accounts in the direct and informed way of someone who is beginning to understand how things fit together and finds it genuinely interesting. Last week, she brought a plant, a small one, something architectural, she said, that does well in rooms without much sun. She put it on the windowsill. I said, It'll need water twice a week. She said, I know, I'll come twice a week. I said, You don't have to do it on my account. She said, I'm not doing it on your account. The plant is still alive. She's been twice. Both times she stayed for dinner. I made the chicken the first time. She made pasta from memory the second, a dish her grandmother had made that I had taught her badly 20 years ago, and that she has apparently spent the intervening time improving in secret. It was better than mine. I told her so. She said, I had a good teacher even when the lesson was imperfect. I think about that a lot. The lesson was imperfect. The teaching continued anyway. The thing it was trying to build got built. That is most of what I know about how to love someone across a long time. You will not do it perfectly. The timing will be wrong. The words will be wrong. You will protect when you should inform and inform when you should have simply stayed. But if the intention is real and you are willing to say so when it matters, the table holds. Patrick came to dinner 2 Sundays ago. He arrived on time. He brought wine and a cutting from a plant in his apartment because Vivian had mentioned the garden beds needed work, and he had something that might do well along the fence. He shook my hand. His grip was not performing anything. His eye contact was the kind that is actually paying attention rather than demonstrating that it is. At dinner, he asked me about the hospital years. His questions were the questions of someone who wanted to understand something rather than assess it. When I asked about his work, he spoke about it with the specific affection of a person who chose correctly and knows they chose correctly and doesn't need you to confirm it. At the end of the evening, while Vivian was in the kitchen, he said to me, Vivian told me a little about the past year. Not everything, but enough for me to understand that the two of you went through something significant and came out on the other side closer. I think that's worth more than most people realize. I said, How so? He said, Because it means you're both willing to do the hard thing when it matters. A lot of people aren't. They let the difficult conversations go unspoken until the silence becomes the relationship. Vivian doesn't do that, and I have a feeling. He smiled, not the practice smile, the real one. That she got that from somewhere. I looked at him for a moment. I thought about the kitchen table, the morning light, the coffee going cold, a daughter with her hands around a mug hearing everything for the first time because her mother had finally stopped deciding when she was ready for it. I said, She gets most of the credit. I just kept the door unlocked. Vivian came back from the kitchen. She looked between us. She said, What did I miss? He said, Your mother was just explaining her approach to architecture. She looked at me. She understood immediately. She smiled. We had dessert. We stayed at the table until the light was gone, and the yard was dark past the window, and there was nothing left to say that needed saying. He washed the dishes without being asked. He did it in the practical way of a man who considers it an obvious thing to do rather than a gesture requiring acknowledgement. Vivian walked him out. She came back in and found me still at the table with the second glass of wine I'd been nursing for an hour. She sat down. She said, Well? I said, He's good. She looked at me. She knew I meant it without qualification, without the undertone that had lived in every previous evaluation, without the protective weight that had made even my compliments feel like conditions. She said, I know. I said, I'm glad you do. We sat there a little longer, The yard was quiet. The plant on the study windowsill needed water again in 3 days. The table was still standing. Everything built to last, still lasting. And the wrist that had been grabbed at a dinner table on an October evening by a hand that had not understood what it was reaching for, completely free.